Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, and Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. How are you?
I am doing well, and I'd like to visit today with you on the subject of North Korea. Are they about to attack us? Are they capable of attacking us? And I've always maintained that the best way to decide whether or not they're ready to attack us is whether or not they have their streetlights on. But they haven't solved the problem of having streetlights in North Korea, so I'm not quite worried that they're on our shores. But anyway, there's always the fear-mongering going on, and you have to have an enemy. The military-industrial complex has to have a justification for building more weapons and aircraft carriers. I understand there are 3 U.S. aircraft carriers in the Far East there, you know, just in case. So they know we are militarily powerful. But I want to talk a little bit about a vote this week. On Tuesday, there was a vote in the House, and once again, it dealt with North Korea. And everybody felt good about it because it passed overwhelmingly, 415 to 2. Happens to be friends of ours that voted against it, but these were sanctions, really, really tough sanctions on the North Koreans because we have to punish them and they have to listen to us and to make sure they never attack us. Of course, our position has been that sanctions aren't all that worthwhile, and they usually do the opposite of what is intended. But the one thing is, it was overwhelmingly passed, Republicans and Democrats, bipartisan support for this effort to say that the approach has to be through militancy. Sanctions, as far as I'm concerned, are an act of war. I mean, they're pretty vicious. And we'll go over a little bit what's in there. If anybody ever did this to us, believe me, whether Trump were president or whether Obama were president, if they did it to us, this country would be just as unified as we were after 9/11. But no, we go and do this, and people justify and say, well, I'm not for war, but I'm for these sanctions. And this is not the first time, but it continues on and on.
And members of Congress cannot play innocent on the sanctions game. We know from Iraq that the sanctions killed hundreds of thousands, mostly children, mostly innocent civilians. We know that's a fact. We know that they target civilians. We also know that they are ineffective. They do not work. They have never worked. So Congress would like to pretend that, hey, I can go back home and boast that I'm getting tough on North Korea, but I'm not for war. But as you said, vote for these sanctions really is a vote for war, and sanctions often lead to war.
Right, and I want to go over some of the points that are made. I mean, the bill is not simplistic. It wasn't a one-page bill like we would write if we wanted to
it was tough to read, yeah.
repeal a certain program. But here are a couple of things. One is to decrease oil imports. Now, you could argue that's military, but people who are going to be hurt are the citizens. They won't have enough gasoline to drive their cars around. And the theory is that when the people are punished, they'll get rid of their leader. But that hasn't worked in the past, has it?
Where's that worked?
Yeah, no, it didn't work in Iraq. They didn't gang up. They gave more support, you know, to the leader when that happens. And unfortunately, these things backfire. It's a ban. They put a ban on textile exports. So there are people working there. There are a few jobs. They make some things. But why is it punishment? Who gets punished? The few people are making pennies over there, and there are a few things going on in North Korea. They actually probably have more activity than a lot of people realize because there's been some signs of economic growth. But here we're going to punish them, but we're going to punish the people. And it never seems like we ever learn.
Yeah, that's the case. So we've got oil, which is going to hurt people driving around if they have cars. It's also going to hurt their home heating. It's a cold country, you know. Ban textile exports, get people out of work.
Yeah.
What else do they?
And also they want to, the North Koreans have some laboring agreements with other countries. Which I think it would be great if it were with South Korea. Yeah. And they probably would if we'd leave them alone. But they're going to end that. They will not have the right to go off and work. That means China, you know, any place that might want North Korean workers. But, you know, there's pros and cons about whether they should or shouldn't do it. But where does it come where we have this authority and presumption that we know that the best thing for the world is to make sure that no individual in North Korea can go and work for somebody else and try to survive. It's just so presumptuous.
Now, what's this North Korean worker who may actually have a favorable impression of the U.S.? We don't know. Here's a guy going over to China, making a few pennies, sending him back home to his family, and helping him get by a little bit. All of a sudden he hears, oh, well, far away in Washington, they passed a law and you can't work anymore. Sorry, too bad. How's he going to feel about the U.S. then? And how's he going to feel about his own leader who's going to be able to say, look, it wasn't me, it was the U.S.?
When we talked about the oil imports, what it made me think about is that was one of the things that we embargoed oil to Japan, and we know what that led to.
Provoke.
But they are also, our sanctions mean no more smuggling. They say anybody who's smuggling in North Korea are going to be punished. Now I got to thinking, well, is smuggling all that bad? I think a fellow by the name of Hancock one time. Yeah. He was a good smuggler, and of course that was an attack on the authoritarianism of the British. But they want to stop the smuggling, and anytime there's a joint venture with another nation, that is to be stopped. But another one, I want to read this one. Ban any foreign entity doing business with North Korea, and they can't do business with U.S. companies, which means that anybody in China, wouldn't that mean that anybody in China doing business with North Korea, they won't be allowed to, or will punish our American companies? That means there'd be punishments for American companies that ever stepped over the line.
Yeah, and of course, and also sanctions on China was our, huge trading partner of ours. And the way they do this is that they say that any international financial transaction going through a U.S. entity, but the U.S. financial network is so worldwide that you literally can't. Ironically, what this would encourage would be alternative financial arrangements that simply bypass the dollar and bypass the U.S., which is what's happening, part of the de-dollarization. But here are the penalties. If you violate all these things, if you happen to let a poor textile worker have a job in North Korea, civil fine, $250,000. That's what you're going to get, or double what the value of the transaction was. But if you get hit with a criminal penalty, $1 million or 20 years in prison.
Oh, boy. And enforcing this is just means more aggravation. But there are some senators who would like to go in a different direction, and we still get back to this whole argument about sanctions being a convenient intermediary doing nothing or going to war. Of course, our position is, that this is an act of war. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people who are generally anti-war will vote for the sanctions, mm-hmm. which is, I think, the wrong position. But there are three senators who have introduced legislation, I think led by Chris Murphy, who has been correct on some of these issues from Connecticut, Schatz from Hawaii, and Booker from New Jersey. They've introduced legislation that said that there can't be any unauthorized attack on North Korea, which, it's good to make the point. But don't you think there should have been an automatic prohibition? What I'm afraid this does, not that I'm opposed to it, I'd support it, but what it does is suggest that a president can do anything he wants unless he's unauthorized. Yeah. And they're saying, no, you're not authorized. Where does he get the authority to do it in the first place? But so we're so far removed from the Constitution and the Congress and the people making these decisions that they have to say, well, there's a position here, you can't do it unless it's authorized. Like I say, I still like them making the point because everything else has come up short, and they don't seem to pay much attention to the Constitution.
At least there's a kernel there. It would be nice if 3 or 4 Republicans would get on and they would band together and say we will do anything. Because an individual or small group of senators have a lot more power than in the House. So a group of them could get together and do their best to block it. But here's something that's disturbing, Dr. Paul. This is Kevin McCarthy, the majority leader of the Republican Party in the House. Of course, in his statement, he talked about, because, this bill is named after the Otto Warmbier, the American kid who was over there. He got himself into some trouble. He ended up in jail. He apparently was in a coma, and he came back. When he was returned, he died. This is named after him. But he referenced the torture of this kid. And, of course, the Hamilton County Coroner's Office found no signs of torture. But here's what McCarthy said, which I think is dangerous. quote, "There is nothing to be gained and everything to lose by working with such an evil regime." So that's it. So there's no point in talking, diplomacy, nothing.
So he would have been pretty critical of Kennedy talking to Khrushchev
when
we were on pins and needles. What's going to happen to the nukes that were in Cuba? So this whole idea that you don't ever talk to people just makes no sense. But that is sort of the policy right now.
Isn't it ironic and sad that this is a tragedy that the kid should have never been put in jail, obviously. When you travel, there are laws that are different than our laws, however, and some countries do have harsh punishments. So he probably should have known better what he was getting into. But how ironic to use the tragic death of this one American to push a policy that may lead to the death of millions of people.
Yeah, it's emotional, it's propaganda, it's the way we go to war. I mean, how many, this is distortion. I wouldn't think that anybody thinks they're participating in a lie, but they haven't kept up well enough because they probably haven't read that coroner's report. And I don't know what their answer would be because I bet they would say, well, I didn't know that, or maybe, well, he wasn't reputable or something like that. But if there's been no signs of torture, it's pretty easy for me to think of the possible diseases a person can get. I mean, there are some diseases that are very, very devastating that could explain it all. But I'm sure the conditions were lousy.
Yeah.
And the big question is, what was the motivation and how did this all come about? But and no government should be excused, for not helping people, under these circumstances. But we don't have exactly an open door policy for illegal aliens coming into this country.
Yeah.
So, but it is still very tragic. It's so sad. But it adds sadness, greater sadness, because they're using it. To say that this is the reason we have to take the next step toward moving toward war. But from their side, they'll say, no, you guys got it wrong because we're moving away from war, and yet the evidence of the last 20 years, especially, the sanctions lead to war. But that's history, generally is the case too. When the sanctions come, it usually ends up to war. It's the trading that they need. And these 6 things that we read off, that was interference mostly in trade. Allowing people to survive and work and make something and sell something. And I am absolutely convinced if we would just mind our own business, get out of there, that they probably would have exchanges from North and South Korea. But when the intimidation is there and they're threatened with an attack from us, they have to come across, because they know that if they're not strong, what happens when we convince people, well, totally disarm and we're not going to touch you, then they get killed. What happened, with Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi. So this is, that explains, why the North becomes more aggressive. But I'm still a strong believer in a more interrelationship with 2 factions, especially North and South Korea. They have every reason, to want to get along, and I think it would soften the stand in the North. So I don't think they're on the verge of what happened in 1950, which I remember clearly, but that was egged on by mostly China and Russia, because we owned South Korea. Once again, it was to expel the Americans.
It's hard to believe you talk about this as an attack on economic activity, and that's the case. It seems to me that if the U.S. really wanted to put Kim Jong-un back on his heels, they would do the opposite. They would get so involved in trade with North Korea, they would open every door, every avenue, find a way to get involved with business there, and that would really put him on his back heels. But we're a little bit depressed reading about this because over and over, here we go. There is one bright spot, and this is Thomas Massey, who was on the board of the Institute, who really is a great voice for freedom and liberty. This statement, it's just a sentence or two from his statement about, because he took a little heat. The Cincinnati paper said, oh, there's one guy nearby who voted against it. But this statement is great. Non-military sanctions have largely proven ineffective. Worse yet, they create tensions with our natural allies, move us closer to war, impose hardships on American companies doing business abroad, and punish civilians in the targeted country who would otherwise be supportive of the U.S. That's great.
Yeah, they should be applauding him, but you know, he gets reelected and probably will be reelected, so that's really the proof that needs to be held, that if a person stands up as an individual and does what he believes in, that the people will understand it and they'll reelect him. So I suspect he'll be reelected in spite of the attacks on him by the establishment.
Yeah, hopefully with a bigger margin. Now, my final word really is kind of a warning, because President Trump will be at the DMZ in Korea, November 7th and 8th. This to me seems like an extremely dangerous time. He's standing there at the DMZ. Will the North Korea take this provocation, which it really is a provocation, will they take that as the opportunity to launch a missile somewhere, and will that blow the whole thing up? I think that's dangerous. What I'd like to see, and I think what you'd like to see, send Jimmy Carter over. He wants to go. What harm could it do? Send him over. So, and also don't forget our book offer through the end of October, ronpaulinstitute.org. There's a little link up top to tell you how to get Ron Paul's latest book signed to you.
Very good, and I want to thank the audience for joining us today. I think this is an absolutely important issue about sanctions, the principle of sanctions and how they fail. And provoking now of the North with Trump going over there can't do any good. I happen to think that it's something we should think about and try to prevent problems, but for many reasons, I think is more rational than most people give him credit for. And if you understand from where he's coming, you understand all his blabbering and talking and aggressiveness, because it's a response, and it's his goal is to establish himself as a strong leader of North Korea, and that he'll stand up to the spreading of American goodness around the world by force, which a lot of people are getting tired of. So sanctions are not the answer. War is not the answer. Trade is the answer. Working for peace and prosperity is the answer. And there's no reason why we can't continue to do this. And I, too, would like to see Trump use Jimmy Carter to go and see what could come of it. And maybe we could take one small step toward peace. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.